Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming tonight, and welcome to another ACMS in-person speaker series. Tonight, we are fortunate to have with us Renatas Berniunas. He is a postdoctoral scholar at the Interacting Mind Center at Aarhus University in Denmark, and he's going to be talking about Setgel, exploring the Mongolian notion of the mind.
Thank you. Thank you. So let's go. But I will have a lecture in English if you don't mind. Okay, can you hear me? Okay. So today's topic is Setgel, as you noticed. But before exploring what Setgel means, I mean, I have to contextualize the whole exploration, where I'm coming from, what kind of discussions I'm involved in, and what is the background. Okay. So I'm kind of having two backgrounds. One is in cognitive sciences. It's about studying the mind and cognition in general. What's the structure of the mind? You know, where does the structure comes from? So basically, mainstream psychology and methodology coming along with it. Okay. But also, I have a background in anthropology, and my interest in social and cultural context is part of my training as well. So when I think about cognition, I always think about culture. Okay, culture is, no surprise, an influential or cultural learning, let's put it that way, social structures, maybe some socio-ecological structures. It's no surprise that they affect how cognition turns out over the development of a child in different contexts. So to talk about cognition without mentioning culture is a bit problematic in my view. Unfortunately, in mainstream psychology, we have a lot of examples of talking about cognition at the same time neglecting social and cultural forces that are forming, you know, cognitive processes in general. And one of these things, is that cognition can actually, in some sense, affect the transmission of cultural information. But I'm not going to talk about that. It's something else that has been done before. But I will focus on one aspect of research in cognitive sciences, mainstream cognitive science, is so-called theory of folk theory of mind. Okay, and what does it mean? It's quite simple and straightforward, but sometimes could be misunderstood. It is how researchers think, in this sense, cognitive sciences, how people think about mind. Okay, because how people think about mind have consequences in social and all kinds of interaction. Okay, that means in social cognition. When you think about your own mind, for instance, and mind of others or mental states of others, that influences how you interpret and how you predict and explain their behavior. So the interest of folk theory of mind, you know, lies basically in trying to understand the basic social cognition. Many psychologists actually argue that this is a basic thing, most important thing in social cognition. Some philosophers would say that this is the only thing in social cognition. But I beg to differ, and this research is basically a step in that direction to try to rethink this whole general kind of assumption in cognitive sciences. But before actually rethinking that, I have to, you know, do some research myself and actually immerse a little bit more in anthropological kind of way of doing things and combining cognitive things together and then talking about that in some writings. So today I'm going to talk about folk theory of mind in a couple of senses. So before Setgel, we need to understand what is this folk theory of mind actually is in the most broad sense terms. You know, so is it a universal kind of aspect of our social cognition? Okay, so is folk theory of mind something that you can find cross-culturally without any problem? Okay. Some would say that this is basically an assumption that we don't have to test. Well, not saying, but basically they assume that it is a universal aspect of social cognition. But unfortunately, we do not have enough evidence to claim that social cognition is as universal as it used to be in mainstream psychology. Most of the evidence comes from, it's a nice acronym, weird samples. It is Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic peoples. Most of the data is coming from this particular sample that is then analyzed and generalized to human beings in general. So some psychologists, especially cultural psychologists and anthropologists, they challenge this basic practice, and this particular paper was kind of influential. We have like 10,000 probably citations by now, just 2010, by Hendrich and his colleagues, where they try to expose that kind of nasty practice of generalizing about the cognition without considering the possible cultural variation. So he ended up with writing a book where he puts all that stuff in a nice kind of narrative and says that weirdest people, or at least the psychology of weird people, it's an acronym, not the word itself, is quite peculiar when you compare it to the rest of the world with the little data that we have. They are actually real outliers. Other kind of cultural contexts have very different kind of ways of talking about the mind and actually how cognition develops. Okay, so we have, there is some doubt about the universality, and I think there is something to it. Okay, so when you think about folk theory of mind, okay, so first thing for me is, where does this, intuition comes from? What mind is, and note that this is English word. An English word, mind dominated academia throughout. About the mind sciences, cognitive sciences, whatever. So English word, not only just Western mind, it's English mind that dominated the whole academia of mind sciences. And there are certain, intuitive things about this mind, okay? Even for me, when I began studying cognitive science and other scientists, when they come to this field, they have the same intuitions, I'm sure. And one of these is just the word itself. Could be, ask the question about the concept itself. So what is the composition, So what it is made of, the mind, in a folk understanding. Then you can ask a question like a second dimension. So what are the boundaries of the mind in the folk understanding, okay? And then you can ask a question, who or what has the mind, the distribution of the mind in the nature and the world in general. And the last one, that is most relevant to this folk theory of mind, is the social purpose. What is it for? Okay, what it does actually in our social interactions. So to summarize the whole, maybe it's not a good way to do it, but to summarize the whole Western English-based mind assumptions, I could say that what is it made of? And it's quite familiar to everyone who speaks English and knows what mind is from the vocabulary. So it's about individual mental states and particular intuitions, thoughts, and desires. We can have a couple of more things added, but the crux of that is that it's individual mental states related to these particular mental aspects. Okay, and it is bounded, to answer the second question, the second dimension. When we talk about the mind in the West, and when we learn about individual psychology, we tend to learn along the way that we have kind of isolated, insulated minds. Okay, so this is the cultural model in the West that dominates. It's pretty much insulated. Okay, and distribution, it's a weird way to put it, is who has it, and it's very much human-centered. So when you start talking about mind, you start only from humans. And from humans, you might go back to the lineage of hominid ancestry, and you might kind of look for some homologies, as they say it, but you will find something, you won't find other things, but it's basically deficiency of human mind in other species, okay? And if you attribute mind to something that is not of a biological nature, to environment, then it's an error attributions. So human-centered kind of understanding is kind of inbuilt aspect of this cultural model. Finally, what is the social purpose of it? Basically to attribute mind, intentions, thoughts, and desires to other humans is to explain and predict behavior. So basically, it's something what would a scientist do. Okay, that's why you have this thing, theory of mind, folk theory of mind. We took it from the scientific practice of theory building and theory practice and theory testing. You can hear? Oh. Someone in the back of this cannot hear me? Okay, it's just weird to speak like that. Okay. Yeah, so explanation and prediction is the purpose of attribution of mind. Okay. So these are 4 dimensions that I want you to keep in mind when we will explore Mongolian case. Okay, Mongolian Setgel. This is the background that I actually keep in my research and the people, the researchers, I'm debating, if you will. So, Mongolian Setgel, okay? If you're wondering why I put this picture, ask me after the whole lecture. It will be clearer when I will finish the whole presentation. So, first thing first is just homework, surveying the whole mental terminology in Mongolian. So what kind of words exist that you could pick up from the dictionary, not only dictionary, but just from talking with people and observing and reading. And by surveying this mental domain, you can come across several words in Mongolian that are also, among other things, translated as mind. It's a very weird kind of situation where Mongolian words are not easily translatable into English. And this is not only about Setgel. Setgel is, from all this bunch of terms, is the most, I would say, versatile, most widely used, and most general term that actually could approximate the generality of English mind. Okay. So I chose Setgel because of that. It is an ancient word. Okay, you can find Setgel reference to Setgel already in this the secret history of the Mongols. So it's dating at least to the 13th century, and I'm sure before that. So it's an ancient indigenous word that probably describes a lot of things of mental nature. It's widely used in everyday life now, and it has, I don't know, over 100 compound words with Setgel. It's impossible actually to grasp all the breadth of applications, but it actually used in a very wide different context. Okay, and it became, you know, part of the modern terminology. Okay, it's quite interesting that Setgel Sotlal or Setgel Tui is psychology in Mongolian. They use indigenous word Setgel to make modern science, okay, to teach students with the Mongolian terminology. But it brings the connotations of its cultural semantics and history, okay. So it's no-brainer to me that Setgel is the best entry point into the more general cultural model of the mind. Mongolian cultural model. Okay, so I chose Setgel, and by picking Setgel in particular, I explored it by using different types of methods to collect data. As a cognitive anthropologist, I combine qualitative and quantitative methods. I do simple, good old ethnography, participant observation, talking to people, seeing how they use it, anything that goes in everyday life, okay? But then you can have more systematic approach. So it's a bottleneck. You start from a more general to a more systematic approach to collect data, and you end up with the most systematic collection of data is I would call field experiments. These are more kind of typical psychological experiments, but in a fieldwork setting, okay? So they are technically more quasi-experiments. And then you go back to ethnographic interpretation, because you do have to make sense of what it means, the data collected here, by going back to more general ethnographic information. So it's kind of feedback loop methodology. Okay, so for me, in this particular chunk of data that I present here, is 3 listings, the most relevant here, and then questionnaires that are kind of field experiment, but not entirely. It's something else I've been collecting, so I won't talk about that. So participants were, I tried to recruit as many different kinds of participants. So one of the, half of the sample is from Ulaanbaatar, okay? And I tried to collect data from people who are more of traditional outlook, more religious and traditional outlook, okay? And from a Hofskul, there is a Burun Toktok Sum to counterbalance. So in this sum, I collected data from local Malchin and this rural population to, kind of helps to counterbalance the more urban population. So you have 50% of this, 50% of that, and then you can make sense of kind of more general data. So free listing, if you don't know what it is, it's a very simple but extremely powerful method in cognitive anthropology. That has been developed actually by American cognitive anthropologists in a more systematic manner. It's a qualitative data that you collect. You basically ask people themselves to provide a list of certain things in a particular conceptual domain, but then you systematically analyze it in a more quantitative manner. So you have emic and ethic kind of perspective at the same time. In this case, I wanted to know the composition of Setgel, like a composition of mind, right? So what it is made of, and you just ask a simple question, okay? So please list all things that make up Setgel. I mean, what do you think Setgel is made of? Okay, and you get a list of many things that people think are salient, and after getting a list, you have a collection of items, in this case 84 items in total. But the most important aspect of this data is that you have most frequently mentioned items and items that are words that are mentioned in a particular list earlier. So that means ranking. This one is just simple illustration of the frequency. It's one of the ways to understand the data. Okay, when you have most frequently mentioned terms and it kind of drops down at some point, it could be read as most cognitively salient items of a particular conceptual structure. Okay, then you kind of plug this particular number of frequency with ranking, so how often it is in a beginning of a list, in a second of item in the list, the third item in the list, or the fourth item in the list. So you calculate it together and you get the so-called Smith's index. And it's an interesting kind of result to me. After a couple of cleaning and coning of the data, I got an interesting kind of picture of the Mongolian Setgel, or conceptual structure of the Setgel, the composition, which looks like this. Virtue here actually is just my more ethic perspective on the category. It's a collection of all kinds of things that you would call virtuous, okay? And to be transparent about that, have a list of items that are falling in this category easily. You know, you could say in Mongolian, I would Buyan or Buyangtan in this case. So virtuous kind of qualities, you know. In English, it nicely kind of captures as well. So part of a Setgel is to have all kinds of virtuous qualities. One of the most salient aspects. It's a very normative approach to the mind. Okay. And then you have two other very interesting clusters that I would call relations, relationality, you know, harılsa in this case. These are just typically straightforward relations with other people. Okay, people start mentioning family members, family in general, society, friends, children, parents, you name it. Or in general, just say posthumus. That's it. That's a very interesting kind of way of talking about the structure of the mind, right? It immediately comes to my mind that there is no such thing in English mind, right? Like this thing also is not in the mind. And social emotions, I mean, I would put in the same category, like a relationality here. No, love, it's all about other people because these are social emotions. It's about loving others. It's about respecting others, you know. So you show certain emotional relation to others. Here you show more kind of social relationship, social role that you play in a particular relationship, and here's more emotional relation to someone. Then you have what I call cognition category, which kind of makes sense also. But to put it all together, it looks really weird when you compare it to the English one, right? Cognition is just generally all these Wuhan, Oyun, bottle, things like that. And all they nicely come together into just cognition, I would call it, okay? Because separately, it just doesn't make sense to put them because they do actually have a category here. And these are cognitive processes. And feelings and all kind of feelings in general, okay? And another interesting thing is body. Some people mention body as part of Setgel, you know? Or body elements, body parts like heart, brain, organ, things like that. So immediately it strikes me as a very different approach to relation between mind and body, right? In an English version, or at least in the Western philosophical tradition, the mind-body dualism is a prevalent kind of approach. And this approach is also visible in this kind of folk understanding of mind and body too, okay? Here is something totally different, right? So you have these kind of categories that are nicely kind of coming together. You can analyze that in different ways. You can actually also try to do some clustering. This one is a simple way of seeing how different items are coming together in the list, you know, how close they are. So if you have ranking, so let's say I mention something from virtue, let's say compassion and kindness, it's more likely that they will come first and second. So that means they are conceptually close. And when you analyze this particular cluster, you see that they cluster together. So they are more likely to be mentioned in the list together. So that means they kind of combine or make a certain cluster, conceptual cluster under the Setgel, a general Setgel kind of notion, right? And in general, when you look at this nice flower plot and this cluster, you see that there is a very strong normative relational dimension. It dominates understanding of a Setgel. Okay. Of course, you have cognition, right? You have some other aspects like consciousness, which is interesting. You have this humanity. I translate it as humanity, but in Mongolian it's hunchanar. So you could say like humaneness, humaneness maybe, and it's something of a quality that you have as a human, right? So it comes together too. What else? So yeah, so for me, the most striking and interesting element and finding here is the strong normative relational dimension, this emphasis, in the Setgel. Thinking is fine. I mean, you can talk about Setgel as kind of expressing some thinking. Even Setgel, this kind of verb version, is thinking. But on the other hand, when you talk about like Setgel hutluch, it's emotional already, So there are different contexts, and it's a very flexible word and concept that could be, molded in some sort of different mental form, if you will, okay? But this normative relational is by far the most visible, I would say. And I think some of you are nodding, so that means it makes perfect sense to the Mongolian participants here. So, exploring the second question, okay, about the porosity and openness, boundedness of the Setgel, okay, like mind. It's a very simple approach. I ask very simple questions to people, like pose these questions. So, can Setgel be affected by someone without, speaking? So it basically brings us back to a more religious context, right? So outside secular context, secular Western context, talking about ways of affecting mind is something of widely actually practiced. And in the Mongolian case, you could ask as well. I mean, different kinds of contexts of being affected by others, including of religious and spiritual nature, like spirit masters, Gazdrinizit, ancestors, Ovugdedes. So these are also very important terms for Mongolians or entities for Mongolians that sometimes affect their daily life and mind. So I asked that. And the results are quite interesting. So, somewhat possible and quite possible to be affected by these entities, and individuals. For me, it makes perfect sense. So when you talk about Setgel as being more normative and relational, it kind of nicely connects to a more open kind of mind to the world, so more porous mind, have more holes that could be, someone affected, and it's less bounded and, closed from the outside world. So it's no surprise to find this particular result. Next is distribution of the mind. In this case, for me, it's the most important, not most important, but let's say, most interesting aspect of difference between mind and Setgel. I would call it more kind of animistic worldview, affecting how the mind is understood in the nature and the world. And it's no surprise that the traditional religious sentiment in Mongolia is very much animistic. By that I mean that there is a relations with non-human persons in the nature in general. It's not only animals, trees, plants, but it's also spirit masters of the place. It's also mountains, rivers, and when you talk to a herder, for instance, about the mountain and the river, it's quite clear that they talk about these entities as having a lot of mindedness, having a lot of kind of mind-like properties, and to ask questions, do these particular entities have mind, makes perfect sense to them. And the results actually showing that except for insects that are probably irrelevant, all the rest entities are basically perfectly minded, okay? And there are different interesting explanations in what way they are minded, but this is a strong animistic outlook about the world outside and relation to the world. So you have a social relation with other people. This is the normative relational understanding of Setgel, but also you have a strong social relationship with the natural entities. Not only, consumerist relationship or of that nature, but also, I would say, social relationship with other than human persons, Okay? And that's quite visible in the distribution attribution of Setgel. So mountains are Setgelte, so it's no problem for a typical herder, of course. And religious Mongolians in the city also quite immediately respond to this question with this positive response. So relationship between this normative and relational Setgel and animistic outlook also is not kind of a big surprise to me as well. Also, if we try to look at the relation between this openness, porosity, and animism, there is also a good correlation and relationship between responses. So all that comes together, you know. All that comes together, Setgel as being normative relational, quite open to the world influences, entities from the world, and Setgel is quite widely distributed in the nature, so you have this kind of pretty much wide net of Setgelte beings, you know. So that's the Mongolian way of thinking and applying Setgel, I would say. So let's go back to the kind of comparative final slide. And if you put mind and Setgel together with all these elements, you know, laid down, you see the difference is quite clear. You have mind as individual, you know, mental states like intentions, thoughts, and desires. For Setgel, is more like virtues and relations, right? Then you have more bounded and more porous notion of the mind and Setgel. Then you have more anthropocentric notion of mind and more ecocentric, I would call it, you know, the animistic outlook. Finally, the social purpose or the purpose in general to apply these different notions of mind and Setgel in one aspect is, in one case is to explain and predict behavior, and in Mongolian case, I didn't discuss that. For me, not in only Mongolia, but in this type of cultural model, I think is to regulate and coordinate social relations, not to explain and predict behaviors by attributing intentions and desires, but actually by having this more kind of inference of virtuous, not virtuous, you know, relations, things like that. It's about coordinating and regulating behavior with social others. That means human and non-human others. Okay. So in general, we have three ways of actually wrapping up. We can still claim, like some philosophers, some psychologists would claim, that these two at least are still the core feature of folk theory of mind, okay, cross-culturally. And if we find, you know, indigenous ways of talking about the mental, these are just nice decorations, inconsequential decorations. They don't change the basic cognitive makeup, okay? So that's the mainstream approach that is not, I would say, maybe completely accepted by everyone, but we do have some people claiming stuff like that. Then you can have a more cultural position, you know, in this case, that like cultural model of mind and a cultural model of Setgel, you know, are products of different cultural histories. So this one is not universal kind of aspect of human social cognition. It's a product of cultural history in the West. Like this one is a product of cultural history in this particular region, right? So you can have a cultural approach, not a more universalistic approach, okay? And finally, I would say that it's more speculative. I have to think more about that. An alternative, more normative, relational kind of position, right? That these aspects like relationality, normativity, and the purpose of kind of regulate and coordinate social relations are the core features cross-culturally. If we, you know, pay attention, even in the West, there are few philosophers who are actually trying to put forward suggestions like that. It's just that we focus way too much on this explanation and prediction and these individual aspects of mental states. And we neglected a lot of things that could be explained with more normative relation position that actually do help to regulate and coordinate social everyday life. Okay, so it's something that could be explored, but all of them are still on the table. I think jury is still out. We just need more evidence and data, but we'll see later how it goes with my research. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, very interesting. So I'm wondering why you split animals and the bees? Because bee is an animal, but it didn't include the animal.
Yes.
Is there any something?
Yeah, insects and animals. Well, biologically, there are different kinds of animals still, right? Insects, and insects and like vertebrates. It's not kind of in the same category. But it's just to have the wider kind of more options, let's put it that way, for people to think about who has the Setgel, who doesn't. And apparently insects are quite irrelevant in everyday life, I'm sure. But even in Talk, when I was also follow-up questions, some sort of follow-up short interviews, I asked, so why insects we don't have? They just would say, couldn't actually respond. But some would say, yeah, they have, because they move, they are animated, so there is some sort of disagreement here. Not like in other cases of trees, mountains, rivers, and spirit masters, so there is no disagreement there. But about the insect, it's not a salient thing, right? So if it's not cognitively and culturally salient, and also kind of salient socially in everyday life, insects are not as salient like mountains every day in front of you, right? Or animals in front of you everyday life, and ovo, that actually reminds you about the spirit master. That's salient, and these are salient, reminders of also rituals and obligations and social kind of relations. Insects have no salience of that nature, I would say.
I was just wondering because for Mongolians, maybe especially for countryside workers, if you think about the community assignments, maybe they move completely first, I don't know.
Yeah, well,
Only the birds.
birds could be, yes. Yeah, true. I think birds would be very much minded, yes. No, eagles and stuff. Crows, smart ones, yeah. Yeah, yes, please.
How big is the sample size?
In this particular study was 112, I think. Yeah, like 56 from Hofschool and 56 from UB. Yes.
Did you find any differences in your answers between the countryside people and the people in UB? And if
Yes.
you did, what do you think your explanation is why their
Yeah.
answers are different?
Yeah, great question. I didn't put the numbers showing differences between two different samples. In many respects, they are quite similar. So this is what I found from my earlier work, that UB people who are of traditional kind of outlook, religious, they follow, quite closely the traditional things, this yos, these ceremonies, these are important for them too. But there are slight differences of emphasis, I would say. Something is more important in the city than in the countryside. Like feelings, for instance, as being part of it, or part of a Setgel conceptual structure, it's more important in the city. And cognition is more important in the countryside, but slightly, in terms of the frequency of mentioning. So feelings, for some reason, for city folks is more important, maybe because you are, still becoming more modernized, so talking about feelings is part of the city life as well. In countryside, pretty well, talking about your own emotions and feelings is no. So this kind of more traditional way of keeping, being Teven, beerbarig, things like that, so you have to keep it to yourself. In a city, you're more open, so maybe that's one of the differences. But all the rest, it seems to be very similar. I also had questions of religion, about religious practices and things like that. There were small differences, like how often do you stop at the Ova, for instance, okay? So country folk, they stop much more often because they are much salient and they are there all the time, they travel. City folks, they don't, because we live in a city and we don't go outside that often, probably. So there are kind of natural explanations why certain differences. But the core aspects, core questions, no big difference. Yes, please.
I was wondering if you could explain more about what normative means with relation to normative relational. I got the relational
Right.
part, but normative was a little confusing. And just as a follow-up to what you just mentioned, I was also curious if there was any difference in the page, like younger respondents
Right,
and
right.
older respondents.
Yeah, but the normative, it's my way of trying to explain a bunch of responses in the free list. So when we see virtues, okay, virtues by nature are normative requirements of particular behavior. You ought to be this or that. So oughtness of something is normative. So if you know anything about moral philosophy, it's about the ought not, And in this case, virtues, qualities is about you should and ought to be this or that, okay? So that's the normative aspect, because it doesn't sound like virtuous relational kind of things to me very nicely. So normative is a more kind of better capturing what's going on there. And previously, actually, I did research about the normativity among Mongols, about the Yosturkhon, for instance, okay? About what is Yosturkhongui and what is not, what is Yosturkhunte. So there are different ways of talking about morality in Mongolian case. And the normative term Yos, for instance, it's as interesting as Setgel because it does not easily translatable into English, It's from ceremony to customs to etiquettes to many different things, right? So in that case, normative cognition for me is more it's a better way to put it than saying it's moral cognition, because English moral, like mind, is not the same as Yosturkhon and Yos, again. So there are interesting differences here. So that's why I use normative, because it's kind of my background, is one thing. Now the second question about age differences, right? And what else? Gender, probably?
Yeah,
Something like that.
curious if there were any differences.
Yeah, about gender, I didn't find any big differences, but age, yes, of course. The older you get, education? Yeah, I actually had this data on education background, but I didn't use it because it kind of was quite similar. It's not. In order to make sense of this data, more statistically, it has to have some variation, right? So it doesn't make much sense to me to use it. But age, yes, it has some difference, definitely. The older you get, right, the more religious you get. The more religious practices you attend to, right? Yeah. So there is some sort of age-related and religiosity. Okay. And I had some questions about kinship relationship, right? Because I didn't discuss here is part of my explanation why you have this type of notion of Setgel, cultural of mind is social structures that exist, social ecological structures. Mongolians are kin-intensive. By that I mean there are close-knit kinship relationships, right? And when you have this type of relationships, right, being affected by the minds and decisions, decision-making is a collective process sometimes, right? And children listen to parents, and parents sometimes decide for children. So, and it's kind of kin intensity does affect the notion of mind, because in the West, according to the Hendricks book, we lost that kind of kin intensity. Beginning from Middle Age, certain reforms implemented by church over the centuries, where kin structures were dismantled, basically, right? You got neo-local kind of family patterns that basically you marry, you move out, and you're on your own. And Americans are an example of extreme individualism in that sense. You guys even have probably pay rent if you stay in your parents' house after 18. It would never happen in Mongolia and anywhere else in kin-intensive places, right? So that's the structure that probably affects also this individualistic psychology, right? Because it kind of, over 500 years, it kind of affects how psychology actually, this kind of widely used model of psychology develops. Mongolian kin-intensive kind of relationships is part of the answer, I think. Right? Why we have this kind of open, relational Setgel notion. Someone will get, oh, yes.
Yeah, okay. I just wanted to circle back to you choosing the word Setgel. Like, can you elaborate on your process of, you know,
Okay.
picking out this specific word?
How did they choose it, yeah?
Yeah, no, did you like consult with
Yes.
like linguistic?
No, I consulted with all my Mongolian friends. I have a bunch of them. So when you just ask questions about Setgel, annoy them. As typical anthropologist is an annoying big child who asks stupid questions and gets gets responses, you know, just tutoring, so to say. So I enjoy that part as well, this ethnographic. So I just ask questions about Setgel. Sometimes I just watch Mongolian TV, right? You see what's going on there. YouTube podcasts. Setgel is a big thing even now. When you survey in the city, everyone talks about Setgel these days, right? And you have Setgel psychology. Setgel Sodlau psychology is kind of emerging as a big thing. So it was no-brainer. It's the most important term probably. Other terms, they don't have that power on different contexts. Setgel is the one I should follow the tracks.
So it's more like based on versatility of the word.
Yeah, based on this, my observations and talks and readings and also just open the dictionary. You just open the dictionary, you see a full page, and someone on the other side is just always different ways of using Setgel. It's already interesting in itself. So that was my choice. I think back was someone.
So taking a step further back from the previous question, what drew you to looking at Mongolia in particular to explore theory of mind?
Why did I choose Mongolia? It would,
Yes. Yes, you know.
well, I've been coming back to Mongolia for many years. It's okay. I spent 10 years of psychology department, okay, so working with psychologists. Most of my publications are in psychology journals, actually. And I was kind of disappointed about a lot of things happening there. And my kind of experience doing PhD research, like for dissertation, my fieldwork in Mongolia, about 14 something years ago, I, always was checking how would Mongolians say, so when we talk about morality, we talk about mind, theory of mind, how they would talk about other terms in philosophy, like free will, things like that. I would ask myself how, in a different culture that is pretty remote, the distance between the Western area and the area of influence here is quite big enough. And I was kind of always finding some differences. And so at some point I began exploring it more empirically. So I did research in Mongolia with different kinds of topics like morality, also free will, if believe it or not. Also did some research in China with the help of my friends. I'm in India, but Mongolia became kind of my main field site because I know best, this place. And I thought that it's not only cross-cultural psychology. You cannot just translate something and just parachute someone and expect to understand what you received. You have to do some hard anthropological work in understanding the culture, acquiring certain knowledge, and it's more long-term process. And I kind of spent some time here, and I tried to make sense of my more cognitive research, by checking notes, checking my notes with Mongolian case. So it's kind of culture, cognition and culture. So culture here is for me Mongolian case. I explore the cognitive questions in Mongolia. Yes, please. So many questions.
Thank you so much for an interesting presentation. So I was actually just reminded of a very interesting philosophical musing from one kind of intellectual giant in Mongolian history. So it's called Danzaraja, or it's Homi Ashok. So it's his title as well as, right? So his musing revolves around the concept of Setgel. So the last two lines read like that. So he basically argues, the context historical is that he argues against the extremely analytical kind of direction of Buddhist sects,
Yes.
as well as the other political kind of time of his era.
Yeah.
So basically, he touched upon why knowledge versus virtue, right? So he touched upon that only virtuous knowledge makes a true knowledge.
Right.
But he also touched on what you mentioned previously, on body-mind problem. So he says on the first line that Setgel is also a kind of an organ itself.
Right.
Right? And it has its own properties, and it can be heard, and it should be also analyzed. But always within the holistic system
Yes.
of human and its relationship. So it's kind of a central, I think we picked up one of the central kind of concepts that can
Yes.
Be an entry point to study
Yes.
not only the moments, but the whole cultural way.
Yes. I totally agree. I think it's just a great example of what just ordinary Mongolians actually think. So when we do apply Setgel, and when I'm saying apply and use Setgel, it's not necessarily conscious. So cultural models operating unconsciously. You just have certain situations in your life, and you apply these models, and the Setgel is applied unconsciously, smoothly, without any kind of interruption. You might kind of be interrupted by some, mistake, some violation, okay, and start thinking consciously about that, right? But for the most part, my argument is that it's an unconscious kind of influence of everyday life, okay? Like in the West, that's why researchers in the West, they're also people, right? They're also folk, they use the models developed, culturally developed in the West. So they intuitively apply, notions of mind that they learned, thinking that this is probably a source of something universal, without any reflection about that. And I ask to reflect, perhaps your intuitions are cultural intuitions, not universal intuitions. Mongolians have different intuitions, so they intuitively apply Setgel quite easily. And we have, a poem from 19th century that shows that it's pretty much a long and ancient tradition that, sticks to the Mongolian way of looking at the things, right? So yeah. Someone was asked. Who? Okay.
You've been talking about English and Mongolian language, and I understand that mind and Setgel can be confused with each other. How about Danish language? Because you're Danish,
Yeah, fortunately I'm not Danish. No. Let me break you the news. I'm Lithuanian, actually. Lithuanian. Yes. Litiv. So in my language, yes, it's another interesting. I mentioned that English mind dominates academia, and it dominates my training as well. So when I was thinking about cognition and mind, I was using the English intuitions, right? I had to learn it, internalize. I never tried to translate it into Lithuanian, honestly. So that's an interesting thing, because in Lithuanian we do not have good, equivalent words for mind, right? Even in Danish, actually, I talked to my friends in Denmark. Mind is not easily translatable into Danish as well. But they are trained and they speak perfect English in English, and they use the same English intuitions when we talk about the mind.
But how can you call this Western?
Because English dominates, it dominates academia.
But
Fair.
there's still this
Right.
language.
Yeah, there are certain elements definitely coming from different linguistic contexts. I definitely agree with that. But emphasis on the individual mental states, I would definitely also argue it's part of the different languages in the Western area, even in Lithuanian too, in Danish too. It's about the individual mental states, but the makeup of these individual mental states could be a little bit different, right? Relationality is not there in Lithuanian language, in Danish language is not there, right? The being porous is not part of the other languages either, from my observation. So I generalized it, to make it, for the sake of the argument, through different languages in the European continent, let's say. A place that was influenced by Christianity and Enlightenment changes of thought. So these are the sources, the cultural and structural changes that affected all these countries equally. So Lithuania is affected by the Christian tradition because it's a kind of a Catholic dominant country, right? And Denmark is a Lutheran dominant country. And Protestantism is another kind of element that actually pushed individualism even further, right? So it's very interesting to see that the shared heritage of more Christian and then Enlightenment traditions is a source of this more individualized notion of mind, even if you use different terms in different languages. I hope I answered. So someone who didn't, yes, you please.
So on one of the slides, it was really interesting that the insect part is like way less than your animals. So I had a theory, and I want to know like your opinion on it.
Okay.
So I'm in a Mongolian language class right now, and we learn like only one word for insect, cockroach, dog. But the rest is like, we don't really know what others are called, mostly because they don't really exist here. I think I see ants, but like, I don't really see any other insects. I never see a cockroach here.
Yes.
I never see a bee here. So I was thinking maybe it's because of that lack of exposure or that absence that maybe it creates a kind of relationship that is more egocentric.
Right.
Compared to like a more anthropocentric in other countries, mostly because like most of Mongolia is very much nature. Like there's only 3 million people here. That I feel like they interact more with nature, whereas develop like a certain kind of attachment to nature instead of develop a bigger attachment towards human. So I was wondering, what do you think about that?
About the insect, yes, you're right. I think I mentioned earlier, it's not salient. And it's not salient because it's not around, right? You have some insects, but they are not so salient, and not salient probably culturally. And this connection, definitely, when I talk about the social ecological kind of influence of the notions of mind, so ecology here is part of it, definitely. And we have a different lifestyle here. It's kind of a nomadic pastoral lifestyle, moving and being connected and dependent on natural forces. So you definitely develop something different from the West that is sedentary, based on agriculture, right? So these are important factors, social, ecological, cultural factors, that shape how mind is conceptualized. So that's my argument here. In the West, it merged this type of mind concept, and here emerged this type of mind concept. And just coming back to this Buddhist kind of example, a poem from the 19th century, Buddhists probably pushed a little bit more analytic notion of Setgel over the history. And it's kind of okay because you do have cognition, part of it. There are several cognitive aspects, but it's not as emphasized as relational. But if you go and ask a Buddhist Lama, I asked a couple of them about the Setgel, they start talking totally differently. They start preaching about the mind having certain properties. So they give you a lecture, the Buddhist philosophical lecture about the mind, about Setgel, as it is taught to them in the philosophy classes, right? And if you ask simple people, the emphasis is, of course, it's more virtue and relation. So the context matters too. And the flexibility and wide applicability of Setgel allows it to be, widely used as well. So I think it's a cool term, if you ask me, and flexible and useful to express a lot of things in different contexts. Yes, please.
I was wondering if you found or came across any similar terms in other cultures. I think Mongolia is interesting because it is not a stereotypical Asian culture,
Yep,
if you
yeah.
will, from a Western point of view, but it's also not a Western country. So
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
something in between, even like from food and just culture itself. I think it's very unique in itself. So I was wondering
Yes.
if you came across anything like that in maybe other Asian cultures.
Well, it's a very difficult question. Well, I came across cross-cultural and cultural psychology literature that focused mainly on East Asia, right? East and South a little bit, like India, but mainly East Asia, China, Japan, and South Korea. So a lot of research in cultural psychology compares these East Asian countries with English-speaking American, mainly American, or Canadian also, sometimes British, but mainly American. So you have kind of two different poles, extremely individualistic and very much collectivistic, okay? And through this lens, you can actually start seeing the notion of different notions of mind, so in East Asia. So in East Asia, yes, it emerges a very different kind of understanding of what a person is, personhood, and mind, and a lot of things relates to what Mongolians have here. But the extra element that I mentioned is this animistic outlook, right? It's much more dominant here and prevalent than in other East Asian countries where the Buddhist traditions or Confucian traditions are much more influential in these countries. So they look at these questions through the lens of this kind of philosophical, ethical teachings and traditions. So that's the difference. So that's why it's so interesting to me, because animistic cultures, Mongolia is not the only one. Many Siberian small groups, also North Asian parts like Tuva, you can go to, and maybe some other Central Asia parts, you could find that too. Also, you could go to South America, Amazonian region, where you have small groups living, very much animistic, shamanic cultures. So these are also places to look into and see how they understand that too. So in the future for research, but I don't have good knowledge of that yet. Yeah. Okay, one more. Okay.
I was wondering, in your literature review, what kinds of other trends you might have noticed in the way Mongolians have talked about Setgel, if other past studies have been done, or just the way you've seen it written down?
Haven't noticed any studies about Setgel. Yeah, actually, I noticed one pretty old, kind of brief, short kind of discussion. Some linguist, I think Mongolian linguist, tried to kind of discuss Setgel through a more cognitive linguistic perspective, like through metaphors, right? Like a container metaphor and like a force metaphor. And there are ways of analyzing different words through metaphorical analysis. So linguists have different ways of doing it. Okay, I'm not a linguist, so it was interesting to read it, but I don't think it captures the stuff that I find here. Right, it just follows the letter of this particular methodology, right, where it leads, and you just get the results that you get. But my idea is go, bottom up, right, from emic perspective, see how people understand, and then see what kind of structures emerge, and compare it later with these Western, let's say, in this case, English context. But I don't know many actually. If any one of you knows any research on Setgel, please let me know. I read one a Russian, actually, since I know Russian too, a paper from Ulan-Ude, some Buryat Institute, some linguists wrote about Setgel a little bit, historical kind of linguistics. That was interesting because I thought she was going somewhere in a similar direction in some sense. So also very brief kind of discussion. But other than that, nope. Okay.
I would love to talk about this all night. We were
Yes.
2 minutes over time, and I think we need to clear out.
Okay, last question.
So thank you so much for presenting your research to us. And I also conduct research on the concept of Setgel, cognitive linguistics. So thank you so much for sharing your research experience with us. And I have 2 questions for you. And the cultural concept Setgel is very broad concept. And the scope of your research seems to be broad for me. So when I listened to your presentation, I sort of found out about the category. So your research covers a lot of categories. And each category is further divided into subcategories. So in terms of your research, in terms of the scope of the research, do you want to cover all of these categories? And do you want to interpret them from the aspect, from the perspectives, different perspectives?
Yes, my goal actually, well, my target audience is still mainstream cognitive science and psychology and philosophy. But so for me, it's a showcase of cultural concepts that shape how shapes the theory of mind, right? Folk theory of mind, right? So in this case, and why it emerges also is kind of a follow-up goal that I have, and this kind of more regulative, coordinative aspect of Setgel rather than explanatory and predictive aspect of mind. So there is some sort of functional aspect to it as well. And I want to kind of dismantle in these categories, as you mentioned, and put it together in a coherent picture of alternative social cognition, model of social cognition. If I answered your question, so.
Thank you. And one more question. So as I understood, Mongolians conceptualize the concept of Setgel as virtuous social relation, social emotion, cognition, etc.
Right.
Yeah. So the social emotion is further divided into subcategories like love, respect,
Right.
jealousy, etc. So what is it based on?
So these are not categories, these are particular items that people mentioned. So these are, in free list you have, every person provides a list of things they think are Setgel, part of a Setgel, okay? And then you calculate and you have a list of things that have been mentioned, in this case like 80 something, right? And I kind of looked several times through that list and I saw that similar patterns emerge, like similar things emerge, like bigger categories, clusters of terms. And I put them under virtue, right, and social emotions, right, but love, respect, for instance, they have been mentioned separately as items in that. So I kind of had this kind of more coded version of it. I have another version that is kind of, coarse-grained, so to say. We have all the items mentioned. You can have a list of that too. It's an interesting way to look at that data as well. But it's kind of bigger list and there is some sort of noise in it. So you need to make a sense of it by coding into bigger clusters that make up the Setgel and then kind of explain why they make up. So normative relational aspect is very important, and I try to explain why it is important. It is for this kind of regulative, coordinative relationship with human and non-human persons, right? Yes. Thank you, everyone.
Everybody, we're way over time now, so we really have to cut it.
Okay, thank you.
Just please join me again in thanking Dr. Berniunas for
Thank you.